So I want to ask you something before we get into it today. Not a rhetorical question, an actual one. What if what if Easter, like this Easter, isn't really about what happened to Jesus, but about what's supposed to happen to us? Stay with me because here's the thing, right? The thing I think happens every year. We do the thing with the egg hunt, the brunch, maybe a church service that feels like it was designed to not make anyone too uncomfortable. And then we go home and nothing actually changes. And if we're really honest with ourselves, we don't expect anything to change, do we? And I think a lot of us, especially those of us who've been burned by church or who are somewhere in the middle of deconstructing everything that we were handed, everything we inherited, have we've quietly started to wonder if the whole resurrection story is just a vibe, a metaphor, a nice thing to say. I think it's an honest place to be at times. But what if it's not? What if it's not a vibe, a metaphor, a nice thing to say? What if resurrection is actually the most disruptive, dangerous, politically loaded idea in the entire tradition? What if the empty tomb isn't the ending, it's the starting gun? I'm your host, Pastor Andrew Shipley, and this is another Missiongathering Christian Church Disciples of Christ podcast. This is our Easter Sunday podcast. Let's get into it. Okay, so in John chapter 20, early in the morning, still dark outside, Mary Magdalene walks to the tomb alone. And I want to stay with that detail for a second, because the fact that she's there at all is kind of remarkable. In first century Jewish culture under Roman occupation, women's testimony wasn't even considered legally valid, right? Like a woman could see something, say something about it, and everybody could know that she's saying the truth and saw it, but it's still not legally valid. You literally could not use a woman as a witness in a court of law. Her word just didn't count. And yet, the Gospel of John, in fact, all of the Gospels have women as the first witnesses. And John chooses Mary to be the first witness to the resurrection, the first person to encounter the risen Jesus, the first one sent to carry the news. You know, some churches have actually called her the apostle to the apostles, right? In fact, that was probably the tradition for a long time, at least a few hundred years, first 100 years of Christianity, which I think is a wild title when you think about it. She's the one who tells the ones who tell everybody else. And she almost got erased. For centuries, the church conflated her with other women in scripture, turned her into a cautionary tale, reduced her to a footnote. The institution that claimed to carry her testimony spent most of its history minimizing the person who gave it. That tension there between the radical thing Jesus actually did and the domesticated version the institution handed us. That's the whole story of Christianity, honestly. But let's get back to the tomb. Mary gets there and she finds the stone rolled away. The body is gone. Nothing makes sense. She runs and gets Peter and the other disciples, and they come and they look around. They take off running too. And this is the kind of incredible, though, right? Like they take off running, see the empty tomb, and they just leave. They go home. She goes and gets them, her fellow disciples, her friends she's been with for 3 years, and they just take off and head back home. Mary stays, though, and she's standing outside crying. She doesn't know what else to do. I mean, what else can she do? She bends down and looks inside, and there are two angels there asking why she is weeping. And before she can even answer that question, she turns around and Jesus is standing right there. She has no idea that it's him, though. She thinks it's the gardener. Let's stay with that for a second. Mary not recognizing Jesus because I think we rush past that too fast, right? This moment where she can't recognize him, and there's other parts of the Bible where that happens too. She's the first witness to the resurrection in the entire Gospel of John. And she doesn't even know what she's looking at. She's standing 3 feet from the risen Christ thinking she's talking to someone who tends the ground, who's been weeding the graves. And to be clear, that's not a failure. That's not a lack of faith. That's just what it looks like when someone is witnessing something genuinely new. Something genuinely new is happening and your brain doesn't have a category for it yet. You ever been there? The theology that's happening didn't even really exist in Mary's mind. Theologian Howard Thurman wrote, "We are so conditioned by the world's definitions of reality that we cannot see the new thing God is doing until it names us first." We have to be addressed before we can perceive. And I think that's important, and it's so important to a lot of us right now because we've been sold a version of spiritual maturity that looks like certainty, like having all the right answers, like never doubting. And when faith stops feeling clear, when old frameworks collapse, when we can't perform the belief we used to perform, we assume that something is wrong with us. But look at Mary, the tower, the apostle of the apostles. She came to the tomb expecting death to be final. She was doing the grief work. She had already started moving on. That kind of moving on that doesn't feel like moving on, just carrying something heavy, keeping on, keeping on. She wasn't deluded. She wasn't naive. She was a person whose reality had been completely shattered and who didn't yet have a new reality to replace it. Kierkegaard, who is this philosopher who's everyone's least favorite person to bring up at a party, unless you're around a bunch of pastor bros, but bear with me. Kierkegaard called this the in-between, the space where old certainty has collapsed and the new reality hasn't arrived yet. He said most people run from that space. They fill it with noise, distraction, premature answers, quick fixes. But the ones who stay in it, the ones who don't bolt, the ones who actually get transformed, those are the ones that don't leave, the ones that stay like Mary stayed. I think that's an invitation for those of us who are in our own version of that in between right now. Maybe you, friend, walked away from church you grew up in. Like, you grew up in the church and you walked away from it. Maybe the theology you were handed stopped making sense when you started asking questions. Maybe you're not sure what you believe anymore, or whether any of this is real, or whether the whole project is worth it. People might say that's you losing your faith, but that's not you losing your faith. That might be a sign that faith is actually finally becoming yours, not inherited, not performed, not maintained out of fear of what happens if you stop. There's a difference between a belief you were handed and a belief you've actually wrestled with. Mary didn't leave the tomb. She didn't just head back. She stayed in the confusion. Confusion. And that's the invitation. So here's the moment, right? Mary, she stays in the confusion, but here's the moment everything shifts when that new reality comes into place. Jesus says one word. Jesus says, Mary. That's it. Just her name. And she knows everything shifts. She knows everything shifts. Not because the confusion is suddenly cleared out, not because she gets a theological explanation, not because it all makes sense, but because she's known personally, irreducibly by her name. St. Augustine, who I have plenty of problems with, wrote that our hearts are restless until they rest in God. I think about that one quote a lot because so much of our lives are spent performing, presenting, managing how we're perceived, building a version of ourselves that gets to exist in public. And underneath all of that, underneath all of it, this exhausted, aching thing exists that just wants to be known, not evaluated, not assessed, not given a score for how well we're doing, known. What happens at this tomb is not a doctrine, not a demonstration of supernatural power, not a theological argument. It's a name spoken in a garden. The feminist theologian Elizabeth Johnson writes that God's call is always particular before it's universal. You are not a category. You are a name. And here's what I think matters about that. Especially, friend, if you've been hurt by institutions. Empires deal in populations, numbers, categories, demographics. Empire says you are a consumer, a constituent, a tax base, a labor unit, a resource to be extracted from. Empire needs you to be abstract so it can make decisions about you without actually seeing you. But the resurrection story says you are Mary. You are known. You are seen. You are called. And the moment you actually believe that, like really believe that, not just as a concept, but as something that's true about you, friend, you will stop accepting the lie that you are nothing. You will stop consenting to being treated as nothing. A person who knows they are known by name is generally harder for empire to control. That's not a spiritual abstraction, that's just true. So he names her. He names her and she immediately knows who he is. She says, Rabbi. And then this is the part that I really couldn't stop thinking about today. Jesus says, don't hold on to me. Don't hold on. Go. Go tell. Go carry this. And just like that, Mary, who came to the tomb to grieve, who stood there in confusion, who didn't recognize who she was talking to, becomes the first preacher of the resurrection of Jesus Christ in human history. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, writing from a Nazi prison cell months before he was executed, said the church is only the church when it exists for others, not for its own comfort, not for its own preservation, for others. Mary doesn't get to stay at the tomb and sit and wonder. Like, she doesn't get to bask in that awe and the wonder of all of it. She gets sent out immediately. And I want to sit with that. Don't hold on to me for a second, because I think we miss how strange and honest that instruction is. She just got the most miraculous thing she could have imagined. The person she was grieving is standing in front of her. And the first thing Jesus says is, don't hold on. Don't make this a moment you preserve. Don't turn this into a monument. Don't let the encounter become a possession. There's a version of faith that turns every sacred experience into something we hold on to rather than something we're sent by. We build our theology around the experience we had. We define our community by the moment we shared. We keep returning to the tomb because the tomb is where it happened. But friend, I'm going to tell you something. Jesus isn't at the tomb anymore. He's already gone, already moving, already out in the world. He's calling you to enter into. The resurrection doesn't give you a shrine. It gives you a direction. Okay, I want to land this somewhere real because I'm not just interested in a podcast that just makes you feel something and then doesn't give you anywhere to go, right? Like we want something more than that. The liberation theologian Gustavo Gutiérrez, and I say this all the time, said, "You say you love the poor, then tell me, what do you know about their names?" To know someone by name is the beginning of justice. It's the literal opposite of what empire does. And resurrection, the whole point of it is that it sends you towards the people whose names aren't being spoken, right? The ones the institution has overlooked, the ones whose testimony doesn't count. The ones standing outside of the tomb crying, right? That's who you're being sent to because no one would stay with them. That's the whole point. And we've been handed a version of Christianity that says pick one: personal faith or public action, spiritual formation or political engagement, inner transformation or structural change. But Mary's story doesn't let us do that. The most personal moment in the gospel, her name, spoken by the one she thought was dead, taken from her, immediately becomes the most public act in the story. She becomes the first herald, the first witness, the first one to carry the news outward, the good news. The personal is where it starts. Always starts in the personal, but that's never where it ends. So when we say something like rise up on a day like today, it doesn't mean like a feeling. I don't mean it as an inspiration that lasts until Thursday. I mean it something something is actually different now. Frederick Douglass said, if there is no struggle, there is no progress. He wasn't talking about suffering to be endured quietly. He was talking about intentional movement against the current. But what actually costs to rise? Rising often feels like friction, like resistance, like moving against what's comfortable, against the silence you've settled for, against the small life that fear keeps offering you. But here's the thing: staying instead of being sent out has its own cost too. Rising isn't adding something to your life, it's refusing to keep paying the cost of staying down. And I think for me, friend, for our community mission gathering, this is a community that is trying imperfectly, stubbornly, consistently to take the resurrection seriously. Not as a doctrine to defend, not as an event to commemorate, right? But as a present reality to be summoned into. We are queer affirming. We are full of people who've been hurt by church and showed up anyway because something in them wasn't done yet with the question of what it means to actually follow Jesus. If any of that resonates with you, come skeptical, come mid deconstruction, come having sworn off church more than once. We've got people like that. We've got a lot of people like that. because we're not interested in the empire version of Easter, the one that stays comfortable, asks nothing of you, and sends you home unchanged. We're trying to do something harder, something more interesting, something worthwhile. We're trying to actually follow Mary out of the garden instead of staying at the tomb, to carry what we've seen into the world, to hear it. I get it. You're still stuck there at the tomb, right? Your 3 words are waiting to be spoken. You're waiting to be known. Friend, you are known by your name. You are being sent into this world not to browbeat it with theology, but to transform it into the kingdom of heaven. So, friend, Christ is risen today. Christ is risen indeed. May you rise with him. Thanks for being here. If this episode connected with something inside of you, share it, not as a pitch, just as a, hey, this might be worth your time. You can find Mission Gathering online and in person, like links in the show notes. And whatever you're carrying this week, I hope you let yourself be known by your name. That's the whole thing, honestly. I'll see you next time. God bless.